then recapitulated chronologically that the same thing as it developed the history under the theme of the city of God. And so there in the, and that happens again in the second triad and on throughout the whole book of Genesis. So within the overall structure of the book of Genesis, thematic arrangement is the signal for non-sequential narration. And so what we are arguing for and what we are seeing here in Genesis 1 is simply more of the same. What Moses was going to do in the mega structure of the book of Genesis, he is doing in the prologue to the book of Genesis. And so when we see this striking thematic arrangement there, creation kingdoms, the creature kings, the creator king, all set up in nice balanced way, that's a pretty clear signal then that we should not be insisting necessarily on chronological sequences being the author's intention, but more decisively then there is the evidence of the first and fourth days. You know, one of the oldest problems you ever hear if you're talking to someone who doesn't believe in the inspiration and the inerrancy of Scripture, one of the oldest problems is day 1 and day 4. How could there be light on day 1 before there were the luminaries on day 4? And in fact, for the other views that we are opposing, whether the solar day view or the age day view, and any kind of view that thinks the sequence is the real one, that is not an answerable problem. I think it would stump us. Happily, that is no problem anymore on the framework interpretation of things. And so we discussed that and suggested at least we didn't deal with all the possible varieties the opposition's approach takes, but the answer in detail to them is available here, and I guess it was around pages 14 and following in the article. So there is just no way of worming out of that difficulty that is posed by the fact that day 4 describes the actual production and the positioning of these heavenly bodies, and nothing less than that is being described here. And so we gave that argument, and then the third, and now we come to the new material here. The third argument, once again showing that the arrangement is not sequential, has to do with looking at the second chapter of Genesis from verses 5 on, and there we discover there's a given revelation there concerning the way things were happening during the creation period, a revelation concerning the modus operandi of the divine providence during the creation period, a revelation that is incompatible with any view of the Genesis 1 chronology that would try to take it sequentially, and that's what we want to look at now in the article Space and Time and the Genesis Cosmogony. That is the final topic I deal with in this typescript of it. It happens to be on page 22, but in where you will find it is simply the final Roman 3 heading, which is called Cosmogony and Providence. Now, there was a hand over there, and maybe this has to do with you have to remind me to do something with.
I was wanting to respond to one interpretation of the sort of light one.
Is it? Have you read my article?
Yeah, I don't know.
No, you haven't.
It has been a while.
Read the article. Okay, and then if you have an approach that I haven't dealt with, there, I'd be glad to hear it. But first, please read the article. Okay. Because I was at great pains to try to take every variation that I ever heard of and to show the utility of it. Because I won't go through all right. But what I thought you were going to ask, I think a couple of people came to me about after class yesterday, and I think I told them to right away at the beginning of this class tell me to deal with it, and that is when we were talking about when we were listing the arguments to show that the chronology was to be taken figuratively, the decisive one there, you remember, was dealing with the seventh day. and the thought that the seventh day was an unending day, and therefore it is the week pattern of which the seventh day is a part is thus shown not to be a literal week of 144 hours or whatever, because the seventh day itself is unending, and the seventh day is an integral part of the week of creation, and therefore the week of creation cannot be identified as a literal, in as much as it embodies here something which is not literal. Now, it is strange, therefore, that which I think constitutes a very decisive argument against literalism. The literalists are always appealing to as one of their main objections to the figurative framework approach, on the basis of the way Exodus 20, verse 11, quotes from, cites the creation days, including the Sabbath day, and makes that to be the model or the basis, the rationale on which God assigns to man the weekly ordinance of the Sabbath. And so the assumption, I don't know whether then, having gone this far to deal with, I might as well, I will be dealing again with that in the course of what we intend to do with this other article, but why don't I continue with it since I brought it up here. The argument is then that when you come to Exodus 20, the fourth commandment about the Sabbath, the thought is, you are to do this because I did it, God says. I worked 6 days and rested the seventh. Therefore, you are to do that. And the argument is that the framework interpretation is cutting away the basis for this. If it doesn't take the days of Genesis 1 in the same sense that the days of the ordinance of the Sabbath have meaning, that is, as ordinary literal days. The assumption, as I began to say then, is that there must be a one-to-one relationship between the divine model and the human copy of the thing. I did it that way, therefore you did it that way. It must be an absolute one-to-one relationship between the two. That's the argument, and it's perhaps the argument that one hears much as any other as an objection to the framework interpretation. Maybe the business about figurative interpretations deny the historicity of it. Maybe those would be, I would say, the two main objections that E.J. Young raised in the articles that he wrote in response to my earlier article, because it had not framed. Well, what do we say about that? I would say it's completely wrong-headed, and for one thing, it's totally contradicted by what we already know and what the analogy of Scripture teaches about the seventh day. If there must be a one-to-one relationship, well, then the Lord has failed us here, because the seventh day in His model is an eternity. And so that we know that in terms of the seventh day, there is not a one-to-one relationship in terms of the length of the Sabbath day. God's Sabbath is an eternity. The Sabbath in the weekly ordinance of the week is not an eternity. There is not a one-to-one relationship. Now, what's going on, of course, is that there is a likeness that is there. And God did something at His level in a certain way, and we replicate that at our level in a way so that there is resemblance. In each case, there is the basic pattern of works leading to rest. And in each case, there is the correspondence in the 6-1 pattern of things. Whether or not the duration of the 6 and 1 in both places the same is another matter, but there is a 6-1 relationship. God was pleased to reveal His creational activity in that form, and therefore that becomes definitive for us of His procedures, 6 and 1, and therefore He stamps that pattern of 6 and 1 upon the sequences of our life existence as we observe time in terms of daily existence. So that this 6-1 pattern is stamped upon it by the Lord. But there is therefore likeness, there is similarity, but with a difference. It's the same thing as comes up in the fact that, man himself is made in the image of God. So there is likeness there. But likeness implies discontinuity as well as continuity. To be made in the image of God means that we are like God, but there is not a one-to-one relationship. We are not God. And likewise then with our activities are to be God-like activities, but there is not one-to-one relationship. There is that which images, which reflects at a creaturely level, the divine original. And so these are fundamental ideas are ignored, and when that particular argument, that objection is pressed, and we keep coming back to the fact that the Bible itself, as we consider what is the nature of God's Sabbath and the nature of the case, God's Sabbath rest is His resting from His creation works. He has finished them once and for all. This doesn't happen again. And His rest, therefore, is something which is permanent. And the book of Hebrews, as we said in chapter 4, says as much. It cites God's rest and identifies it with the seventh day in Genesis 2:2. It says it's still going on. So that's the end of that whole way of thinking. That's the end of the objection from Exodus 20:11. I'm amazed that people continue to bring it up. Yes?
And isn't it in fact the seventh day rest, and the spiritual reality for that in human beings in the New Testament is formulated in the rest that we have in Christ, that goes on 7 days a week for us, and then it'll be also manifested in the eternal rest that we'll have after Christ returns. So even in that sense, it doesn't seem to be faulty.
Not to run it by me again. The New Testament teaches that our total experience is...
I was just saying the New Testament teaches that the Sabbath rest is now in Jesus. The spiritual reality of the Old Testament Sabbath rest is now in Jesus 7 days a week, and then our eternal rest will be after Christ returns. So even in that sense, that seems to speak against this argument also.
I'm not quite sure of the point you're making. If we say that our rest in Jesus is one which is 7 days a week, this is true in a sense, but this could be used to argue that the Sabbath as an ordinance has been obviated now by the presence of the reality, and that may be your position, and we'll eventually be discussing that very difficult question of the Sabbath ordinance and its place in New Testament life. And when we do, I will be arguing at least the traditional position that the Sabbath ordinance is still one that we follow on earth, because even though in the spirit, in terms of, we analyze eschatology in the New Testament is already not yet. And so in terms of the already aspect of New Testament eschatology, then what you are saying is true, that in our spirit, in that mystical way in which we are already in the heavenlies resting with Jesus, that is true. But meanwhile, our bodies are walking this earth, and we have not arrived at the consummation of earthly history, which the Sabbath prefigures and symbolizes. And so in terms of the not yet aspect of New Testament eschatology, we are still pilgrims making our way unto that rest which Hebrews 4 says yet awaits us up there. So in that sense, we haven't gotten there yet. And in terms of that, I personally think that there is still room for the ordinance of the Sabbath. That far I'm conservative on the subject when it comes to how the Sabbath is to be observed. I'm no longer happy with the traditional.
Right, but taking that view, my point is, okay, so taking what you just said and assuming that, which is fine with me, then the reality of that 7-day rest on earth is anyway an eternal rest that will end up for us in heaven. So it seems to me...
So therefore it's not a literal 24
Well,
hour.
in eventuality, in the future, the reality of it is a spiritual reality of heaven. So that seems to just support your argument that it shouldn't be taken literally, but it's eternal just as God's. Ours will be eternal just as God's is now. And that's what we're doing here on earth is just a physical manifestation of what will be the spiritual reality after we're united with Christ.
Okay, if you say that's supporting my position, I'm all for it. I'm working on this. Someone else had a hand.
The creation days, upper register time, God's time, of which the command in Exodus 29-11 is a copy that they're supposed to follow, and it's quite literal. And I was just reading in Hebrews 9:23, it talks about a heavenly the temples and the things in the temple, which the things in the literal temple were a copy of in the heaven. And I've heard people argue quite because they don't want to take this literal. If it's a copy, then there must be an actual building with an actual altar in heaven, which Christ had to actually take blood up to and offer on this altar up in heaven, because they want to hold to that literalness. And I would say that's the conclusion you would have to come to if you want to do that with days. And in order to have 6 sequential literal days on earth, you would have to have 6 literal days up in heaven, and you would have to also do that with the temple and other things which are described as being in heaven and copies up on earth.
Could be that they are of a piece. I don't know if someone on the other side would try to find some way of finding a difference between those two things, but on the surface of it, that may well be the case.
So then is it you believe that the science that really dictates a non-literal, that what we know now about the universe really dictates, in your opinion, a non-literal view of Genesis 1?
You're raising a rather different point now. You're raising the question of how our reading of the evidence of nature out there, natural revelation, is to be related to this.
In terms of literal versus non-literal.
Yeah, if I understand your question, of course I'm saying that the biblical picture is one that would accommodate these billions of years history, 15 billion, whatever is now soon to be the age of the universe back to the Big Bang. And that it can accommodate that precisely because it isn't literal. If it were literal, it obviously couldn't accommodate that. But that is my ultimate conclusion, that if the scripture is taken and properly executed and come up with the bonus position that you can accommodate the evidence of science, but methodologically, I'm not wanting to start with that. I don't want to see when we conclude our exegesis that is an implication, all right, and that certainly is the implication we come to eventually. Well, and if we may get on with this third point, which is intended to demonstrate the non-sequential intention of the biblical narrative, it has to do, as I said, with what is revealed in Genesis 2, verse 5. And I will, I think, come back and read this, but I think it will help if I can just briefly present the point of it all. What we'll be seeing here is that in Genesis 2:5, which is right after that first Elah, Tola, Dot heading, these are the generations of. And we have here a dipping back, first of all, into the creation period. Now, as we argued and I think demonstrated, wherever you have that heading, Elah, Tola, Dot, these are the generations of. What follows is not basically an account of where X, the person named, comes from. It's not an account of his ancestry, but it's an account of what follows after him. It's an account of his posterity. And so when we find the heading in Genesis 2:4, these are the generations of the heavens and earth, the section that follows is not primarily another account of the creation story, but it is an account of what took place on the heaven and the earth after they were created. And as a matter of fact, if you follow on in chapters 2, 3, and 4, you find that to be the case. It's really an account of the history from the fall up to the flood. Nevertheless, right at the beginning of this section, it does dip back into the period of what Genesis 1 calls the 6 days. And that's not a novel thing. When we come to the second of the Eila Toledot sections, which is in Genesis 5:1, these are the generations of Adam. Once again, what follows that is not so much an account of Adam's creation as it is an account of his ongoing genealogies down to the time of the flood. But again, there, right at the beginning, it dips back chronologically and tells us that God created Adam in his own image. So right at the beginning of these sections, there can be a little dipping back into the past. So that's what happens in Genesis 2:5 and following. It takes us back within the creation period, and what it talks about here, then for one thing in the midst of, we'll outline the chapter and so on, but in the midst of the discussion, we find the text talking about vegetation and saying there was no vegetation, no trees. At some point within the creation period, whether with respect to the whole world or narrowing down the focus upon the Garden of Eden, where the drama of the covenant was about to transpire. But it doesn't matter for this argument to which way you take it, in the broader or the more localized sense. Somewhere during the creation period, the situation obtains that there is no vegetation. Now, the significant thing, I called the article because it had not rained. And again, it's not a great profound argument. It's a very simple, taken for granted sort of a thing that we find here. What we are then told is why. Why didn't God create the vegetation yet? No rain, no water. Could God create vegetation without water? Keep it endlessly alive without water? Sure he could. But how was he functioning? How was he functioning during the period of the 6 days with respect to those things that he created? Here, there is an assumption that, again, is one that you cannot successfully accommodate on any view that takes the material in Genesis 1 sequentially. Let me just finish out the way the second chapter developed. There was no water available, no rain, because it had not rained. That's the answer. There was no vegetation because it hadn't rained yet. There wasn't a natural supply of water, which is the natural precondition for plant life to live and to grow and to flourish. And so then the text goes on to the way that this situation was remedied. The text also says there was no man. And the thought being that, well, if someone's going to quibble, then they would say, even if you don't have rain, you can have vegetation flourishing. If there's a man to be the artificial irrigator here, to engage in cultivation of the soil and so on, he can bring the water from over there with his ditches and his canals and irrigate the field, but no man either. So the normal natural ways in which plant life, whether in the wilderness out there in the field or in the cultivated areas where man would operate, in none of those places was there a natural supply of water, and that's why God didn't create the vegetation. And so, of course, vegetation ultimately did come into existence. What had to happen first? God then brought rain into the picture, and this involves then the exegesis of the language there, and especially the difficult term in Hebrew, the word aid, which has been variously taken, but which in my article I take in the sense of rain clouds, which bring the rain upon the earth. So then the Lord did bring the rain upon the earth, and then after that He created the man too. And so by the time you're done with this process, and this is what the second chapter of Genesis is primarily concerned to do, the stage has been set, the scene has been laid for the big drama that's going to unfold in the third chapter. Now we have the scene with the vegetation, and especially with those two trees out of the realm of vegetation, which were going to be critical in the probationary testing of man, the tree of knowledge and the tree of life, these covenantally rich symbolic trees. They're real trees, but with symbolic meaning. They are there now. The stage is set. man is on the scene. Later in the chapter, we have the account of the other principle, of the creation of the woman, and that's what chapter 2 is all about. So that's why these things are being discussed. Bring before us now man in the garden, vegetation, man brought together. But the key point for our present discussion then is simply this, that here the text it's unargued. It just takes for granted. It's something we should all assume, that during this process of creation, God didn't create things before He had created the kind of environment in which they could be naturally sustained. In other words, He was not going to not only create things supernaturally, but then preserve them supernaturally. That's not the way He was functioning during this period. No, it was the opposite. Now, then, before getting to read, let me then try to clear the air of any misunderstanding here, because it's a very common one. People think when you're saying this, that the modus operandi of God's providence was natural, that you are also denying that there were any supernatural acts of creation during this period. That's a common misunderstanding and objection, but it is a total misunderstanding of the position. Now, this is talking about divine providence as over against the creative activity of God. Absolute creation ex nihilo in nihilum is what Genesis 1:1 describes. All right, we looked at Genesis 1:1 in some detail, asking what does in the beginning mean and what does heavens and the earth mean. And I concluded there that in the beginning takes us from the point of absolute creation at the beginning, and I certainly affirm that, and the Scriptures teach it. An absolute act of origination beforehand. God, eternity, nothing else. Now, by an absolute act of origination and creation, God brings into world this space-time continuum. Now there is a world, so that's absolute creation. Now there is a world within which God's providence operates. What is God's providence? It is His rule over and His care for that which He has brought into being. And so as soon as there is something for Him to control and to rule over and to preserve, He is involved in it. All right, so we have God's providence. And that's the question we're talking about. Along the way, now let's say X marks an act of supernatural origination. God zaps the situation with supernatural creative power. How many X's do we need between Genesis 1:1, the act of absolute creation, and the arrival of the Sabbath? The 6 days compose a block of time. As a whole, they constitute a block of time, a closed period of time. And within this closed period of time, God produced all of the significant varieties, Genesis calls kinds, all the significant varieties that He ever intended to bring into existence. They might undergo slight variation among themselves and so on, and have various stages. Man has created a natural body. Later on, beyond the first 6 days, he is transformed into a glorified body, but he remains essentially the same time. Within this 6-day period, God creates all the significant varieties, and some of them certainly required more supernatural zaps. Adam did. All right? So we certainly hold, as over against a macroevolutionary view, that Adam's physical constitution could be derived from a life continuum process of evolution, whereby ultimately some advanced hominid form is taken by God as a living creature and transformed by depositing in it a human soul of some kind. That's out. That is not something that the Scriptures allow. God, according to Genesis 2:7, took something which was lifeless, not something which was alive, and made it into him. That's the whole point of dust. Dust is lifeless stuff. What Genesis 2:7 describes It's not God's taking something living and making it into a human by injecting a human soul into it. The point of Genesis 2:7 is that God took something which was lifeless and animated it. He brought it to life, and the same act that animates it as a human being and nothing else. So this is material I will probably want to discuss again later, but all I'm saying now is that I, as one who hold this view of God's providence being natural, confess freely and gladly that this was a supernatural act that occurred there, as well as the absolute original act of creation ex nihilo, out of nothing. And I also then throw in the phrase in nihilum, into nothing, to bring out the thought that there was no prior context of created reality out there. It was only God. It was only His eternity. It was Eve, creation of Eve. Out on the side of another one. How many more X's do you want? 100, 1,000, 2, 5? We could discuss that. Does the origination of life, all the different levels of life, flora, fauna, all of the kinds. I'm prepared to have as many as might be necessary. So there is no from there to keep the plants alive. All right, so that's the summary, and then what we'll try to show beyond that is that you tried to accommodate that on your sequential. The middle of the chapter, then, in terms of the literary arrangement, describes the site of the dramatic event. So first, Adam's creation has been mentioned there in 5 through 7, and then you go back and describe the site, which was certainly set up there before the man was created and put on the site. So the problem. The Hebrew aid, this verse, all right. Verb 6 must be relating a new development, not something concurrent with the situation described in verse 5 and so forth. The aid in verse 6 answers to the previous lack of rain in verse 5b. If the aid does not refer to rain, I'm arguing that it's going to be a rain cloud, not just mist coming up from the earth, but it is the whole cycle of rain is taken for granted with the rain clouds, and they are producing the rain that was absent before. If the aid does not refer to rain, but to some other alternative, which would have been a satisfactory water supply, the previous absence of that alternative should have been included in verse 5b in the listing of the missing sources of water. Indeed, if the aid solution is not equitable with the rain whose absence was the problem, the citing of the absence of rain in verse 5b would itself be stranded as an irrelevant. Why mention that back there if that wasn't there? These considerations argue in support of the identification of the Hebrew aid with a word in the cognate material from the site of Ebla. I trust you've all heard about this site in Syria to the north, and the texts that have come from there with all kinds of interesting material bearing on the patriarchal narratives and so on. And there, as was pointed out by the scholar Dahoud, who did the very helpful big commentaries in the Anchor Bible series on the Book of Psalms, as he was the first to point out, there is a word, the equivalent of the Hebrew idu, it is, which means a rain cloud. And I don't think there's any doubt then that that's what the real meaning of this rare word in the Hebrew is, and it is a rare word. Also, the one other context within the Bible, I said it's rare, there's only one other context where it's found. That other one context is all about rain clouds. And that passage is in Job 36. It extols the greatness of God, who spreads the clouds abroad and sends down showers on man, so giving food in abundance. Job 36, verses 26 and following. And verse 27, in the midst of that, speaks of God drawing forth the drops of water. And then repeating the image, the parallel clause in verse 27b adds the source from which the rain is distilled, namely the aid, which would then be the rain clouds. So God draws forth the drops of water from the aid, which must be then the rain cloud. That's the meaning in Job 36 of confirming our understanding that aid there refers to the rain clouds, and that's what verse 6 has in view. Likewise, in Genesis 2, the originating of the aid as a watering system is implicitly attributed to Yahweh Elohim by the previous tracing of the absence of that provision to his determination. And another Job and echo of this is heard in Job 38, challenging Job's knowledge of storm phenomena. The Lord illustrates his own creation-wide sovereignty by the example of his provision of rain and vegetation, not just in agricultural areas, but in the wilderness where no man is. Well, maybe I'll just finish this paragraph for a moment. The springing forth of plants, at least the wild plants that need only the rain. And, I think what would be helpful if you are looking at Genesis 2:4 and following these verses and trying to see the questions that I'm trying to solve here with these comments. But the springing forth of plants, at least the wild plants that need only the rain and not man the cultivator, is simply taken for granted. Having said that the absence of the vegetation was due to no rain, then having said that then rain began, it's assumed then, of course, we know that now the vegetation was provided. Is taken for granted in Genesis 2:6 as a consequence of the provision of the prerequisite water, a consequence occurring before the creation of man, verse 7. And moreover, what you have in verse 8 is in another case then of thematic arrangement rather than chronological. Verse 7 describes the creation of man, and then verse 8 talks about the planting of the garden where these trees were. And I don't think as many actually have taken it that we should think that man was created first and he's held in limbo someplace, and then God proceeds quick to plant a garden to have some place to put him. The Lord has prepared the place for Adam beforehand in that garden, and he creates him within that place. So even the Lord's planting of the garden with its trees, verse 8, is not to be located after the creation of man, since the verb for planting here can express the pluperfect. And so if you look at verse 8, I don't know if any version have a nice pluperfect, the Lord had planted, because that's what's called for. Anyone raise your hand? Which one? NIV has had?
Yeah.
Had. Good for them. Any others you see that didn't? What does it have? Just planted.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Never mind.
All right, but many in the English version would just leave it ambiguous, but I'm glad to see. You'll find me criticizing the NIV translations of many a passage along the way, so I'm glad at some point I agree with them. I can criticize them because I was heavily involved in working on the NIV, but it's not all it could be. Since the form of, all right. In the absence of rainfall, man can dig irrigation ditches to bring the necessary water to his cultivated land, and hence to round out the explanation of the absence of vegetation back in verse 5b, the absence of man was added to the absence of rain. But once God had caused it to rain, the Eden garden could be planted without man yet being present, and I would say certainly God did, and then he placed the man there. When therefore the creation of man is narrated in Genesis 2 verse 7, this act is not to be subordinated to the theme of the production of vegetation. However symbiotic the relation of man and the cultivated plants, man was not made for the plants, but the plants for man. The report of man's creation, verse 7, stands apart as an independent statement announcing the presence of the main party in the upcoming probationary crisis to take place in connection with the trees of the garden, the theme of the following narrative. Then let's say 20 of up there. I'm afraid it does. Let me finish this point off and then take the break. That would be better than coming up and having to repeat. Then I have a paragraph which takes this exegesis of Genesis 2 and relates it, which is our present main concern. It relates it to the creation week of Genesis 1. What was the nature of divine providence during the creation week? That's the question. All right, divine providence during the creation week. More specifically, By what means did God preserve such things as he had brought into existence? Embedded in Genesis 2:5 is an answer to that question that has decisive implications for the interpretation of the chronological framework of the creation account. Whatever uncertainty may perplex the exegesis of any of these details that we just ran through in Genesis 2:5 and following, the point that we have to make here for our present purposes does not depend on the adoption of a particular interpretation of any of these details. What it does depend on, indeed what it consists in, is the simple, incontestable fact that Genesis 2:5 gives an explanation, a perfectly natural explanation for the absence of vegetation somewhere within the creation week. Genesis 2:5 tells us that God did not produce the plants of the field before he had established an environment with a watering system, the natural, normal precondition for plant life. The assumption, the unargued assumption underlying Genesis 2:5 is clearly that a natural mode of divine providence was in operation in the course of the creation days. Now, acts of supernatural origination did, lots of zaps, lots of X's on that line, did initiate and punctuate the creation process. And had God so pleased, his providential oversight of what he had created might also have been by supernatural means during the six-day process. Genesis 2:5, however, takes it for granted that providential operations were not of a supernatural kind, that God rather ordered the sequence of creation acts so that the continuance and the development of the earth and its creatures could proceed by natural means. This unargued assumption of Genesis 2:5 contradicts the reconstructions of the creation days proposed by the more traditional views. In other words, I'm arguing here that you can't be a believer in the inerrancy of Scripture and follow either the literal solar day view or the day-age view. Any view that would hold the sequence involves you in finding errors in the Bible, a contradiction between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Now, just to show some of that, you take the literalist view. The scenario, which is conjured by the literalist solar day interpretation, is in fact utterly alien to the climate and the tenor of Genesis 2:5. Within the flurry of stupendous events, describing the literal view and how you'd have to reconstruct the thing, within the flurry of stupendous events which their view entails, each new cosmic happening coming hard on the heels of the last one, and all transpiring within a few hours or days at the most, the absence of vegetation or anything else at any particular given point would not last long enough to occasion special consideration for the reasons for it. Within that time framework, such a question would be practically irrelevant as to why there wasn't vegetation. Before you can turn around, there was vegetation and rain and everything else. Genesis 2:5 reflects on an environmental situation that has obviously lasted for a while. Time has been passing. There's no vegetation. One begins to wonder about that and to give there's no room for that whole kind of setting in the helter-skelter rush of events on the literalist view. It reflects on an environmental situation that has obviously lasted for a while. It assumes a far more leisurely pace on the part of the Creator, for whom 1,000 years are as one day. The tempo of the literalist's reconstructed cosmogony leaves no room for the era, E-R-A, era perspective of Genesis 2:5. Genesis 2:5 gives you the clear picture that you are dealing with. There are vast epochs and eras of time that are involved that give rise to the questions like why was there no vegetation. And in specific contradiction of the disclosure of Genesis 2:5, both the solar day and the day-age theories must assume that God did use other than the ordinary secondary means in the providential sustaining and further shaping of what his creative word had called into being. Now, some examples of that. How these other two views inevitably involve you with the assumption that what has been produced is continued, the life is preserved by supernatural means, rather than, as Genesis 2:5 tells us, it would have been by natural means. We've already seen that any view that insists that day 4 presents events chronologically later than those in day 1 must posit some means other than the sun, moon, and stars of day 4, something extraordinary, even supernatural, to account for the effects of light and the day-night cycle mentioned in day 1 and for its continuance. And so on day 1 we have the presence of light and it's the day-night cycle, and if it is not something then which is produced and continually controlled by the relation of the sun and the moon and this whole business to the earth, if that is not there, then there had to be some spectacular other supernatural means to account for it, and Genesis 2:5 contradicts that the way the Lord was operating. It would also have to be by some such means that the vegetation whose production is described in day 3 was sustained apart from the presence of the normally prerequisite sun of day 4. So now here we're talking about the relationship of days 3 and 4 and so on. This is talking about vegetation in Genesis 2. Well, we get vegetation in the creation days on the 3rd day. And Genesis 2:5 tells us God would put in the vegetation before there was water, because that's what is naturally needed for the preservation of plant life. But alas, in the narrative sequence, the sun is not related until the 4th day, and the sun is, as much as the water, necessary for the natural growth, the whole process of photosynthesis and so on of plants. And so the sequential views all assume that, contrary to Genesis 2:5, vegetation was placed in the world by God, even though the natural means of sustaining it, namely the sunlight and so on, wasn't present until later on. Well, that's a flat contradiction, and have to put. And you can see then another reason why they are so gung-ho trying to eliminate from what the text says about the 4th day the idea that God actually produced the sun on those days. But that is what the text actually does say. Likewise, on any strictly sequential interpretation of the narrative, the existence of all flora, day 3, all vegetation, all flora, before any fauna, which are produced on days 5 and 6, that sequence, all flora before any fauna, would include extraordinary means of preservation in those situations, those symbiotic situations that we know of, where the survival of a particular kind of vegetation is actually dependent on the activity of animal life. So there are those relationships where you couldn't have all kinds of flora before there were some kinds of fauna, and yet the sequential view would put you in that predicament. For according to them, the earth would have come into existence, and of course, the existence of the earth itself on day 1 confronts the traditional approaches with a gigantic exception to normal providential procedure. For according to them, the earth would have come into existence by itself as a solitary sphere, not as part of the cosmological process by which the stars and their satellites originate, and it would have continued alone, suspended in a spatial void, if we may so speak, for the first 3 days of creation. All the vast universe whose origin is narrated on day 4 would then be younger, even billions of years younger, than the speck in space called Earth. So much for the claimed harmony of the narrative sequence of Genesis 1 with scientific cosmology. And that is not the way God naturally sustains planet Earth in this world with its cycles of a day and night and so on. He sustains it in terms of all of the laws governing this expanding universe from its Big Bang origin down to the present by those natural means, vast that they are, but natural means, and not by some supernatural process such as would be involved in these other views. So, in short, if the narrative sequence were intended to represent the chronological sequence, Genesis 1 would bristle with contradictions of what is revealed in Genesis 2:5. Our conclusion is, then, that the more traditional interpretations of the creation account are guilty not only of creating a conflict between the Bible and science, they do that, but in effect they are guilty of pitting Scripture against Scripture. The true harmony of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2:5 appears, however, and the false conflict between the Bible, there are conflicts between improper views of science and the Bible, but the false conflict between the Bible and science disappears when we recognize that the creation week is a lower register metaphor, a figure for God's upper register creation time, and that the sequence of the days is ordered not chronologically but thematically. So there is that one, and let's take 5 minutes for a break. Now, how to condense or focus this huge, what I want to do now then is to move over to the article Space and Time in Genesis Cosmogony by itself. We have been using parts of it because within the new argument that I developed within this article, I use this as a sort of an umbrella under which I incorporated some of my previous arguments, as you saw, including the one from my 1957 article, because it had not rained. But then I did try to do something new and fresh with a confirmation of the figurative, metaphorical nature of the chronological data. And what I did there then was to try to show that the whole Genesis 1 account, and by the way, then here, once again, although our subject is narrowly the simple question of the nature of the chronological days, my interest in this article and our own interest in general should be much broader than that. We aren't just concerned with the question of how long, but what we should be concerned about and trying to get as much light out of Genesis 1 as we can on the subject is the whole subject of biblical cosmology. What is the Christian view of the nature of the cosmos? And in fact, I think in our whole development of systematics that there perhaps should be another locus. And we deal with theology, and we deal with the doctrine of man, anthropology, and the doctrine of sin, and the doctrine of soteriology, and somewhere along the line we work in our Christology and our ecclesiology and our eschatology. I think in that sequence someplace it would be very useful to have a section on biblical cosmology, which we would find was very closely related before we were done with the subject of the work of the Spirit, as well as eschatology, by the way, so that I see that there's a block of biblical revelation dealing with things that we all as human beings and Christian people certainly are curious about, is to how we should understand the makeup of this world that God has created, which is our home. And as I say, it turns out ultimately, as perhaps we'll have occasion to be showing here, to be tied in with the subject of the Spirit, of pneumatology, an aspect of theology then that gets somewhat short shrift, and the reality of the Spirit's presence in the world as a revelation of God emerges, especially as we begin to analyze what biblical cosmology says about the nature of heaven, for example. And further, inasmuch as the pattern of things which is established there in the beginning, as we understand what heaven is we're really dealing then also with eschatology, because there in the heaven as it was originally created and which continues forever is the future. This is a case of back to the future by going back to heaven as it was produced from the beginning, because that heaven, especially as it moves into its Sabbath stage, as Genesis 1 describes God moving into the Sabbath stage of his heavenly experience, if we may put it that way, is the ongoing reality and rest into which we are going to enter as the eschatological telos of our human existence. And so the shape of things to come is there in the shape of the heaven Sabbath that God originated in the first place, and the pattern by which God betook himself from day in the beginning to the Sabbath, the process of engaging in works which then is at last rewarded as God receives his Sabbath rest and the works of his hands pleasing him and contributing to his glory. And meanwhile, as he has been performing these works, and before then he receives his Sabbath reward, he has been engaged in judging his own works day by day. He looks and he judges and he says, good, good, good. So there has been a work of judgment. So you've had an eschatological pattern, no less. Right? That's what Genesis 1 is, an eschatological pattern, a pattern which is one that you get to heaven. You get to the consummation Sabbath stage via a process of works which then undergo divine judgment and then result, if done properly, in the heavenly reward. There is the pattern of eschatology that is followed throughout Scripture. It's imposed on God's covenant with Adam. It is worked out ultimately in terms of the redemptive process and God's covenantal dealings with us through Christ. But this subject then of cosmology here at the beginning is of all kinds of fundamental and vital importance. As I say, I don't see why it hasn't been more developed as a locus of its own within systematic theology. And I wonder if our neglect in that area hasn't created a vacuum into which stuff like New Age philosophy and its interest in cosmology and so on hasn't entered. And that if we had developed some biblical views and answers to this, it wouldn't have left such a vacuum, because people are interested. It showed the success of that New Age type of cosmological thinking. It shows that people have a need to get answers on this. So that's part of which I'm trying to address, not just this narrow question then of the nature of the days of Genesis, which is really a relatively unimportant thing. If it were not, that it is of such great ecclesiastical importance and vitality for you people as you're going to try to get yourself licensed and ordained in the face of the hostility that's going to come to you if you follow these views, and you are going to suffer for righteousness' sake if it were not for that, I think it was worth our time to spend this much time on this particular subject. So now then, trying to do something with this as a little contribution toward biblical cosmology as well as toward our immediate subject. Let's say this then, and we've already had occasion to say some of these things, but according to the Bible then, we've spoken about dealing with Genesis 1 verse 1. We said heaven and earth represents, there is your cosmology, and it involves an invisible realm as well as a visible realm. And in this particular article, then, I began to adopt the language of upper register and lower register. Someone asked me yesterday why I did that, and I couldn't remember why I adopted that language. Thinking of it afterwards, I think that maybe one reason I did was because just the language of heaven becomes a little bit ambiguous. If you keep talking about heaven, you're not sure whether you're talking about the visible heaven or the invisible heaven. And so the language of upper register, lower register has the advantage then that it keeps those two things clear. So let's go back to Genesis 1:1. And part of what I want to do here is to show how this two-register approach informs the whole account of creation. Why don't I say what I hope to do overall and then go back and see if we can do it. I'm going to try to show that in Genesis 1 verse 1 we have the upper register represented by heaven, and we tried to show the biblical evidence that that doesn't refer to the realm of God on his throne in the midst of all of the dominions and powers and so on. Colossians 1, speaking of Christ's role in connection with that, emphasizes that that aspect of the invisible heaven. And then the other term, earth, registers is pointing to the visible world of our human experience here below. Then what we'll continue with is to show that in the second verse, you get these same two things continued. What represents heaven is the word spirit. A moment ago in my general introductory remarks, I said that if we get into the subject of cosmology, and especially the concept of the invisible heavens, we'll find ourselves very much dealing with the subject of pneumatology, cosmology of pneumatology, because of the identification so much of the spirit with that heavenly realm. Just jumping way ahead, for example, to the last book in the Bible, it's an interesting detail that brings out this connection, is that each time that the text says that the Apostle John was in the Spirit, and that phrase occurs about 3 or 4 times in the book, each time it occurs, we find that he is in heaven. To be in the Spirit is to be up in heaven where God is on his throne surrounded by all his angels and so on. So there's that kind of a close identity of the two that we want to explore further. And so verse 2 speaks about the Spirit, Meredith, hovering over. This is the first metaphor for God in the Bible, and it turns out to be a bird metaphor, an alien one. It's a picture of like an eagle hovering over its nest and so on. And so here is God's promoting, fostering presence over the world, but also the thought turns out to be here is the heavenly model that is going to be reproduced here in the lower register, because that's one of the aspects of the relationship of the two. They are to be distinguished, but what we find is happening over and again is that heaven is reproducing its likeness on earth. We talked a little bit about that when we talked about the Sabbath problem there, Exodus 20:11.